Before the rain reached the cliffs, before the headlights of the black sedan disappeared around the bend of Marrow's Edge Road, before anyone in the city below realized something irreversible had begun, a woman sitting alone in her car pressed her phone to her ear and whispered a sentence she never thought she would have to say. "Caspian, there's a car behind me, and I don't think they're going to stop." The line went silent. She waited. She tried again. "Caspian, if you don't pick up tonight, you're going to spend the rest of your life wishing you had." 40 miles away, in a hotel suite on the 22nd floor, the most feared man on the eastern coast looked at his phone, saw her name on the screen, and turned it face down on the marble nightstand. Because men like him were used to giving orders, not answering them. And tonight, of all nights, he had decided his wife could wait. The city of Halverston sat between two things that didn't belong together: the cold gray Atlantic on one side and a ridge of old wooded hills on the other. The wealthy lived on the hills, in glass houses that watched the water like patient animals. The rest of the city lived below, in narrow streets that smelled of salt and exhaust, in apartments stacked too close together, in lives that were always one paycheck from collapse. It was the kind of city where everyone knew the name Vance, even if they pretended they didn't. That night, the rain hadn't started yet. It was coming. You could feel it the way you feel a held breath, the air too still, the streetlights casting halos that didn't move, the gulls strangely quiet at the marina. October had come in soft this year, and the leaves on the maple trees along Pelham Avenue had turned the color of rust and old gold, and they hung there waiting for the wind that would take them. Marrow's Edge Road wound up the back of the western ridge, 2 lanes of black asphalt cut into the side of the hill, with a guardrail on one side and a steep drop on the other, falling 60 feet into a ravine of pine and stone. Locals called it the Spine. It was the fastest way home from the city if you lived in one of the houses near the top, and the most dangerous way if you didn't know the curves. The houses up there were old money, restored Victorians with wraparound porches, modern builds with cantilevered decks, walled estates with wrought iron gates that opened only for cars they recognized. There was a quiet up there that the rest of Halverston didn't have. The kind of quiet that money buys when it has been earned for long enough to forget how it was earned. At the top of the ridge, behind a stone wall and a row of black cypress trees, sat the Vance estate. 3 stories, slate roof, a long curved drive lit by lanterns that came on at dusk. From its eastern windows you could see the entire city below, the harbor lights, the cathedral spire, the bridge that crossed the inlet, the small dark stretch of Marrow's Edge curving up the hill. If anyone had been standing at those windows at 9:47 that night, they would have seen a single pair of headlights climbing the road. They would have seen a second pair following, closer than they should have been. But no one was standing at the windows. The house was empty. And on the dashboard of the car climbing the hill, a thin gold bracelet caught the lantern light as the woman driving turned the wheel into the first curve and reached, one more time, for her phone. Her name was Vesna Marchetti Vance, and she was 34 years old. And she had spent the last 7 years of her life believing that love was a thing you could repair the way she repaired the paintings she worked on, slowly, with patience, with the right tools, with a steady hand and a heart that refused to give up on what could still be saved. She was an art restorer. She worked in a small private studio on Lantern Street called Halverston Conservation, a narrow brick building with northern light and high ceilings, and the smell of linseed oil and old varnish that she had loved since she was 19 years old. She had been there for 9 years. She had restored a Caravaggio fragment in her 2nd year. She had been the youngest restorer in the studio's history. The owner, a soft-spoken woman in her 70s named Drusilla Beaumont, had once told her she had the hands of a surgeon and the eyes of a poet. That night, Vesna had stayed late at the studio. She often did. She was working on a small oil painting from the 1880s, a portrait of a woman in a green dress, and the cracks in the surface were the kind that required her to slow her breathing while she worked. She had stopped at 9:18 because her hands had started to shake from hunger, and she had cleaned her brushes the way she always did, and she had washed the grease and pigment from her fingers in the small porcelain sink in the back, and she had taken off her wedding ring to scrub under it the way she did every night, and she had set the ring on the edge of the sink to dry. She had forgotten it there. She remembered, halfway down the stairs to the parking lot, that she had forgotten it. And she had paused, and she had thought about going back, and then she had thought, no, I'll get it tomorrow. And she had walked out into the cold and gotten into her car. That ring would matter later in ways she could not have known. She wore other things that mattered. A thin gold chain bracelet that had belonged to her grandmother, a woman from a small village outside Genoa, who had crossed an ocean alone at 19 and built a life with her hands. Vesna wore it every day. She touched it the way some people touch religious medals, absently, often, without thinking. She hummed when she worked. Old songs her grandmother had taught her. Songs about the sea and about waiting and about women who watched the horizon for ships that did not always come back. She had a voice that surprised people the first time they heard it. Low and warm, slightly hoarse, the voice of a woman who had laughed often and cried in private. She was beautiful in a way that was difficult to photograph. Dark hair she usually wore pulled back, a small scar above her left eyebrow from a fall when she was 11, eyes the color of strong tea, a mouth that smiled slowly and rarely fully. She was also, that night, terrified. She had noticed the car 6 minutes after she left the studio, a black sedan. Too close behind her at the second light. Still behind her at the third. Still behind her when she turned onto Pelham Avenue. When she turned again onto the access road for Marrow's Edge, when she began the climb up the spine. She had called her husband at 9:31. It was now 9:47, and she had called him 7 times. She was not a woman who panicked. She was a woman who had spent her career steadying her hands over 400-year-old paint. She knew how to control her breathing. She knew how to think clearly when her body wanted to scream. She also knew, with a clarity that came from somewhere old and certain inside her, that if her husband did not pick up the next call, she was going to die on this road. She glanced at her bracelet on the steering wheel. She thought of her grandmother, who had crossed an ocean alone. She pressed his name on the screen one more time. She had met him 14 years earlier on a Sunday afternoon in late spring, in a small bookshop on the corner of Vine and Ashbury, the kind of place that smelled of old paper and bergamot tea, and that closed too early on weekends because the owner believed people should be outside. She had been 20. She had been kneeling in the poetry section, looking for a copy of Montal, and she had reached for the same book at the same moment as the man crouched beside her. Their hands had brushed. She had looked up, ready to apologize, and she had found herself looking into the face of a young man with dark eyes and a careful mouth, and an expression that was, in that single second, completely unguarded. He had been 26. His name was Caspian Vance. She had not yet learned what that name meant in this city. He had bought her the book. He had asked her to walk with him to the harbor. They had walked for 3 hours, and he had told her things he had told no one before, that his father was a hard man, that his older brother had died at 20 in circumstances no one in the family ever spoke about, that he was being trained to take over something he was not sure he wanted, that when he was alone at night, he sometimes drove out to the cliffs north of the city just to listen to the water and pretend he was someone else. She had told him that she restored paintings, that she believed almost anything could be saved if you were patient enough and gentle enough and willing to work in the dark for a very long time before the light came back. He had looked at her for a long moment after she said that, and he had said, "Then maybe save me." She had thought he was joking. He had not been joking. They were married 3 years later in a small ceremony at a chapel on the northern coast, with 26 guests and a string quartet playing music her grandmother had loved. He had stood at the altar in a black suit and watched her walk toward him with an expression on his face that she had carried in her chest like a small held flame for the next 11 years. She had known what his family was. She had known what he was becoming. She had chosen him anyway, because she had believed, with the conviction of a woman who had spent her life saving things that other people gave up on, that there was a part of him still worth saving, and that her steady hands and her patient love would be enough. For the first 3 years, she had been right. For the next 8, she had watched the man she married disappear in slow increments, the way a painting fades in a room with too much sun, the late nights, the phone calls he took in the next room, the bodyguards who appeared and never left, the dinners he missed, the mornings he came home smelling of someone else's perfume. 6 months before that night on Marrow's Edge, she had found out about a woman named Ondine Kassar, 28, a model from a coastal city in the south, who had been seeing her husband for nearly a year. She had not screamed. She had not thrown anything. She had sat at the kitchen island for 40 minutes in complete silence, and then she had stood up, and she had walked into her studio at the back of the house, and she had begun, in silence, to plan her exit. What he did not know was that she was almost ready to leave. What no one knew was that she was running out of time. The second curve of Marrow's Edge was the one the locals called the wishbone, a tight S that doubled back on itself between 2 outcroppings of pine, the kind of turn where if you didn't know what was coming, you could lose the wheel for half a second and never get it back. Vesna knew the curve. She took it carefully, both hands on the wheel, and she watched in her mirror as the black sedan took it carefully behind her. That was when she understood. A drunk driver would have drifted. A teenager showing off would have gunned through it. The car behind her was not lost and not reckless. The car behind her was waiting. She pressed Caspian's name on the screen for the 7th time, and she put the phone on speaker, and she set it on the passenger seat, and she gripped the wheel with both hands. The line rang. Once, twice, 5 times. Voicemail. She did not break. Her voice when she spoke was the voice of a woman who had spent 15 years steadying her hands over things that could not be replaced. Caspian, it's me. I am on the spine. There is a black sedan behind me. It has been behind me for almost 20 minutes. I think they are going to do something soon. I need you to call me back. I need you to send someone. I need you to pick up your phone. She stopped. She listened to her own breathing. She kept driving. 41 miles away, on the 22nd floor of the Sant Rock Hotel, Caspian Vance lay on his back in a king-size bed with the sheets twisted around his legs, and he watched the ceiling, and he listened to the shower running in the next room. His phone buzzed on the nightstand for the 7th time. He turned his head and looked at it. He saw her name. He saw the small blinking icon. He saw the number 7 beside the missed call symbol. He thought, she's been like this lately. She knows. She's testing me. He thought, I'll call her in the morning. I'll bring her flowers. I'll fix it. He thought, one night. I just want one night. He turned the phone face down again. In the car, Vesna saw the lights behind her change. The sedan had moved into the oncoming lane. It was pulling alongside her now on the narrow road. And she could see, in the half-second before it happened, the silhouette of a man in the passenger seat with something in his hand. She did the only thing left to do. She picked up the phone from the seat, and she pressed his name one more time, and she spoke the words that would later be played in a small room by a man who had not deserved to hear them. Caspian, if you don't pick up tonight, you're going to spend the rest of your life wishing you had. I love you. I have always loved you. I am so sorry I could not save you. The sedan moved closer. The guardrail on her left buckled. The wheel went light in her hands. The world tilted. Her last thought was not fear. Her last thought was the green dress in the painting on her studio easel, the small section of cracked varnish she had not yet repaired, and how she would have liked, very much, to finish it. The car left the road at 61 miles an hour. In the hotel suite, the phone buzzed once more. Caspian Vance did not turn his head this time. He closed his eyes. He fell asleep. He had no idea that his life had just ended, and that a different one, harder, smaller, truer, was about to begin. Caspian Vance was 40 years old, and he was, by every measurable standard the world used, a powerful man. He had inherited the Vance organization from his father at 31, after the old man had died of a heart attack in the back of a car on the way to a meeting he should not have been taking. The organization controlled the eastern docks of Halverston, 3 legitimate construction companies, a shipping firm with offices in 2 countries, a string of restaurants that no one ever audited, and a network of relationships with men in suits and men in uniforms that ran so deep into the bones of the city that no one could say with confidence where the city ended and the Vance name began. Caspian had not wanted any of it. That was the truth he had told only one person in his life, and she was, at that moment, on a road 41 miles north of him, calling his name into a phone he would not answer. He had wanted to be an architect. When he was 19, he had drawn buildings in a small leather notebook he kept in the drawer of his desk at the family house, buildings with curved roofs and open courtyards and walls of glass that let in the morning light. His mother had found the notebook once and had smiled at it the way mothers smile at things that will not survive contact with the world. His father had found it a year later and had thrown it into the fireplace without a word. His mother's name had been Leora. She had been a tall, soft-spoken woman from a Hungarian family, and she had played the piano badly and sung beautifully, and she had loved her sons with a tenderness that did not know how to protect them from the man she had married. She had died when Caspian was 13, of a stroke, in the kitchen, in the middle of making him a sandwich. He had come home from school and found her on the floor. His father had remarried within 11 months. The new wife had been 26. She had not been cruel, just absent, and Caspian had learned by 14 that the safest thing a man could do with affection was to keep it locked in a small box in a small room in the back of himself, and to let no one, not anyone, hold the key. Then, at 26, in a bookshop on the corner of Vine and Ashbury, a young woman with dark hair and tea-colored eyes had reached for the same book of poems that he had reached for, and the small box in the back of him had cracked open without his permission. He had handed her the key that afternoon. He had spent the next 14 years trying, in increasingly clumsy ways, to take it back. That was the part of him no one in his organization knew. They knew the man in the tailored suits, the man who could dismiss a meeting with a single nod, the man whose voice never rose because it did not need to. They did not know the boy in the kitchen who had held his mother's hand while the paramedics came. They did not know the young man who had drawn buildings in a leather notebook. They did not know that he had married a woman who saw all of those things, and that he had been, in his cowardice, slowly running from her ever since, because being seen that clearly had begun to feel like being touched on a wound. Ondine Cossar did not see him. That was the appeal. She saw the suit. She saw the name. She saw the way other people moved around him in restaurants. She wanted those things, and she did not want the boy in the kitchen, and so being with her felt, in a way, Caspian had never been able to admit out loud, like a vacation from himself. That was where he was that night. On vacation. In a hotel suite. With a woman who did not know his middle name. The shower stopped running in the next room. Ondine came out a few minutes later, already dressed, drying her hair with a towel, and she said something about ordering room service. He answered without listening. She sat down on the chair by the window and began typing something on her phone, and he stared at the ceiling, and the silence between them was the silence of 2 people who had nothing to say to each other, and had stopped pretending otherwise. His phone buzzed once on the nightstand. The 8th call. He did not turn his head. He thought about Vesna in a way he had not let himself think about her in months. He thought about the small humming sound she made when she was concentrating. He thought about her hands. He thought about the way she had looked at him on their wedding day, like she was looking at someone she had already forgiven for things he had not yet done. He thought, tomorrow. I'll fix it tomorrow. He did not know that he had, in that exact moment, run out of tomorrows. In a ravine 60 feet below Marrow's Edge Road, a black sedan with one headlight still working pulled away from the wreckage and turned south toward the city. Inside Vesna's car, the radio was still playing, very softly, an old song her grandmother had loved. The rain that had been waiting all evening began, finally, to fall. He woke at 6:14 in the morning. The light coming through the hotel curtains was the gray of early autumn dawn, thin and tired, the kind of light that makes everything in a room look like it belongs to someone else. Ondine was asleep on the far side of the bed, her back turned to him, her breathing slow and even. Caspian eased out from under the covers without waking her, and he sat on the edge of the bed for a moment with his face in his hands, not because anything was wrong yet, but because something in his body had begun to feel wrong in a way he could not name. He reached for his phone. 7 missed calls from his wife, the last one at 9:54 the night before. There were no calls after that. There was, however, a single missed call from Soren Maddox, his consigliere, the man who had served his father for 30 years and had served Caspian for 9. The call had come in at 5:48 that morning. There was a voicemail. Caspian pressed play. Soren's voice was a voice Caspian had heard in every register a voice can have, calm during a federal raid, and steady during a funeral, dry during a courtroom indictment. He had never, in 9 years, heard it sound the way it sounded in that voicemail. Caspian, wherever you are, come home. Now. Don't ask me anything. Just come. Caspian stood up. He did not remember standing. He dressed without looking at his clothes. He left the room without waking Ondine. He did not leave a note. He took the elevator down 22 floors, and he walked out into the gray morning, and he got into his car, and he drove north out of the city the way a man drives when he has not yet allowed himself to know what he already knows. His phone rang on the seat beside him. Soren again. Where are you? Bridge. 10 minutes out. What's happened? A long pause. Long enough that Caspian heard, on the other end, the sound of a man swallowing. Don't drive yourself. Pull over, I'll send someone. Soren, tell me. Another pause. It's Vesna. Caspian did not pull over. He drove faster. He drove the river road, then the western artery, then the access road to Marrow's Edge. He saw the police lights from a half-mile away, blue and red bleeding through the morning fog at the second curve, the one the locals called the wishbone. He saw the broken section of guardrail. He saw the tow rig parked on the shoulder with its winch line running down into the ravine. He stopped his car in the middle of the road. He got out. He walked. Soren was already there. He had been there for almost 2 hours. He met Caspian at the edge of the broken rail, and he did not say anything. He just put a hand on Caspian's shoulder, and Caspian looked past him, down into the ravine, and he saw what was left of his wife's car against the trunk of a pine. They had already taken her. A young officer, no older than 26, came up the slope holding a small clear plastic evidence bag. Inside it was Vesna's phone, the screen cracked across the corner, still faintly lit. The officer looked at Soren first, the way men look at the man who outranks the situation, and Soren nodded once, and the officer handed the bag to Caspian. Caspian held it in both hands. He thought for a strange second of his mother's hand in his on the kitchen floor when he was 13. Soren said in a low voice, "There are voicemails, Caspian. She left voicemails." Caspian did not answer. He was looking at something in the back seat of the wreck, visible through the shattered rear window that the officers had not yet bagged. A thin gold chain bracelet on the floorboard broken in 2 places, still catching what little light there was. He sat down. He did not mean to. His knees just stopped working, and he sat down on the wet asphalt at the edge of the road, and he did not move for a long time. Soren crouched beside him. Caspian, listen to me, we will find them. Whoever did this, we will find them. Caspian shook his head. He was not shaking it at Soren. He was shaking it at himself. He took out his own phone with hands that were not steady. He opened his voicemail. He saw the 7 messages from the night before, all of them stacked there, all of them unheard. He pressed play on the first one. He heard her voice. Calm, controlled. Caspian, there's a car behind me and I don't think they're going to stop. He closed his eyes. The rain began again, very lightly, on the shoulders of his coat. He listened to all 7, in order, on the side of a road 41 miles from a hotel suite, where a woman he did not love was still asleep in a bed he would never return to. When the last one ended, he did not move for a long time. He did not go back to the hotel. He did not call Ondine. He did not message her. He did not, in the hours and days that followed, ever speak her name aloud again. Soren had a man go to the suite by noon and pay the bill and make sure she left, and that was the last administrative task anyone in the Vance organization ever performed on her behalf. From that day forward, in every room Caspian walked into for the rest of his life, Ondine Kassar became a person who had never existed. He went home instead. The estate at the top of the western ridge was empty when he arrived. The lanterns along the curved drive were still burning from the night before. He had not turned them off. She had not turned them off. They had been waiting, all night, for a car that had never come up the hill. He walked through the front door and he stood in the entryway, and he listened to the house. There is a particular quality of silence in a house where someone you love has just stopped existing. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is the silence of a room that is still, somehow, holding the shape of the person who is no longer in it. The coat she had hung on the hook that morning, the scarf she had draped over the banister, the half-empty cup of tea on the small table by the window where she had been reading the day before. All of these things were still there, and all of them were now objects in a museum no one would ever visit again. He walked through the rooms slowly, the kitchen, the dining room, the library, the conservatory at the back of the house where she kept the small spider plants she could never quite keep alive but refused to throw out. Oh, the stairs to the second floor, the hallway, her studio. He stopped at the door of her studio. He had not been inside it in almost 2 years. She had asked him, a long time ago, not to come in unless she invited him, because the work she did required a kind of quiet she could not maintain when he was nearby. He had agreed because it had been easy to agree, and because he had not understood at the time that what she had really been asking him for was a single room in their life that he had not yet contaminated with the other thing he was becoming. He opened the door. The studio was a long room with 2 tall windows and a work table in the center and a small daybed against the far wall, where she had often slept when she was working through the night. There were paintings everywhere, leaning against the walls, propped on easels, wrapped in soft cloth on the work table. The smell of linseed oil and varnish and something that was simply her, faint, warm, unmistakable, came up at him from the floor of the room like a wave. He saw the folder on her desk. It was a plain manila folder, unlabeled, sitting on top of a small stack of papers. He did not know, when he picked it up, what it was. He opened it because in that moment he was a man who needed to put his hands on every object in the house she had touched. The first document was a divorce filing, prepared but not yet submitted, dated 6 weeks earlier. The second was a lease, signed by her, for a small apartment in a city 400 miles to the south, in the artist's quarter of a coastal town she had visited once on her honeymoon and had spoken about, occasionally, the way people speak about places they secretly intend to return to. The third was a one-way plane ticket dated for the 11th of November, 18 days from the day she had died. The fourth was a letter. It was sealed in a cream-colored envelope with his name written across the front in her handwriting, the small, precise letters of a woman who had spent her life working with a steady hand. The envelope was not new. The corners were soft from having been picked up and put down many times. He sat down on the edge of the daybed. He held the envelope for a long time before he opened it. The letter was 3 pages long. She wrote that she had loved him for 14 years. She wrote that she had loved him on the day they met in the bookshop on Vine and Ashbury, and she had loved him on the day they were married, and she had loved him on the night he had first lied to her about where he had been, and she had loved him every night since, even on the nights when loving him had felt like holding her hand on a stove. She wrote that she knew about Ondine. She wrote that she had known for almost 6 months. She wrote that she did not want to be the woman who screamed in a kitchen and threw a glass and made him choose, because she was not interested any longer in being chosen. She was interested in choosing. She wrote that she was leaving not because of the betrayal, but because of what staying was going to cost the children they did not yet have. She wrote that she was 34 years old, and she had begun, recently, to imagine a daughter. And the thought of that daughter watching her mother accept what she had been accepting was the thing, finally, that had broken something open in her that could not be put back. She wrote that she still believed there had been a man in him worth saving. She wrote that she had tried for a long time to be the one who saved him. She wrote that she understood now that no one can save another person, that the most anyone can do is stand in the doorway and hold the light for as long as they can, and that she had held the light for as long as her hands could carry it, and that she was sorry she had not been stronger. She wrote that she hoped, very much, that one day he would become the man she had seen on the afternoon in the bookshop, the man with the unguarded face who had asked her to save him. She wrote, in the last line, "I will always be the woman who saw you first. Vesna." He read the letter once. Then he read it again. Then he read it a third time, slowly, the way she had taught him, years ago, to look at a painting. When he was done, he folded the letter back into its envelope, and he held the envelope against his chest with both hands, and he made a sound that no one in the Vance organization had ever heard him make, and that no one ever would again. It was not loud. It was the sound of a man who had been carrying something for a very long time, finally setting it down in the wrong place. He sat on the daybed in his wife's studio for a long time. When he finally stood up, he took her wedding ring from the small dish by the sink where Soren's man had returned it that afternoon, and he threaded it onto the chain he wore around his neck, the one his mother had given him at 12, and he closed the clasp. He whispered into the empty room, the only words he had left. "I'm listening now." The men who had killed Vesna were not difficult to find. Soren Maddox had been in the organization for 39 years, and he understood the eastern coast the way an old fisherman understands the tide. By the end of the second day, he had a name. By the end of the fourth day, he had 3. By the end of the first week, he had the entire chain, the men in the sedan, the man who had given the order, the family that had paid for it. The family was named Voronin. They had come into Halverston from the north 4 years earlier, and they had been pushing slowly against the edges of Vance territory ever since, and Vesna had been a message. A signal that the head of the Vance family had grown soft, that he had become distractible, that he could be reached through the people he loved. Soren laid the file on Caspian's desk on the 7th morning. He stood in front of the desk the way he had stood in front of Caspian's father 100 times, hands at his sides, waiting for the order he had spent his life giving in another man's name. Caspian read the file. He read it twice. Then he did something Soren had not expected. He closed the folder. He set his hand flat on top of it. He looked at Soren for a long moment, and he said in a low voice, "We are not going to do this the way you think we are going to do it." Soren waited. Caspian said, "My wife was a woman who restored things. She believed almost anything could be saved if you were patient enough. She married a man she thought she could save, and she could not save him, and she died on a road because of who he chose to be. I am not going to honor her by becoming more of what killed her. I am going to honor her by becoming less of it. Soren did not speak. Caspian said, "Find me the lawyers, the forensic accountants, the federal contacts. I want the Voronin family dismantled. Not killed. Dismantled. I want their assets frozen. I want their territories absorbed. I want the man who gave the order to spend the next 30 years of his life in a federal prison, watching everything he built belong to someone else. I want him to live a long time, Soren. I want him to live long enough to understand what he took." Soren said, after a pause. "And the men in the car?" Caspian said, "Same. All of them. Every one of them alive. Every one of them ruined." Soren nodded slowly. "That is harder than killing them." Caspian said, "Good. It took 11 months. It cost more than killing them would have cost, by an order of magnitude. It required Soren to call in favors from men who had not spoken to the Vance organization in 2 decades. It required 3 separate federal agencies to receive, anonymously, packets of documentation so meticulously assembled that the indictments wrote themselves. It required the cooperation of 2 judges, 1 journalist, and a forensic accountant from another country whose name would never appear in any record. When it was over, the Voronin family did not exist anymore. Their warehouses were empty, their bank accounts were frozen. Their patriarch, a man named Yarema Voronin, was 63 years old and serving the first year of a 40-year sentence in a federal facility in the middle of a state he had never visited. The men in the sedan were serving smaller sentences in smaller places, but they were all serving them. The night the last indictment was handed down, Caspian sat alone in Vesna's studio and read her letter again, and he did not feel triumphant. He felt, for the first time in 11 months, still. He stood up. He walked to the window. He looked out over the lights of Halverston spread below the ridge. He picked up his phone, and he called Soren. "I want to start something." Soren said, "What kind of something?" Caspian said, "A foundation, in her name, for women who are trying to leave." There was a long silence. Soren said, "Caspian, do you know what you are saying?" Caspian said, "Yes." Soren said, "You are saying that you want to spend the rest of your life helping women leave men like the man you used to be." Caspian said, "Yes, that is what I am saying." Soren was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice Caspian had never heard from him, the voice of a man who had served 2 generations of Vances and had begun, that night, to understand that he was finally serving the right one. "I will set up the meeting in the morning." The Vesna Marchetti Vance Foundation was registered 8 weeks later. Its mission statement was a single sentence, written by Caspian himself, in handwriting that took him 3 drafts to make steady. "To stand in the doorway and hold the light, for as long as our hands can carry it, for any woman who is trying to walk through it." The foundation took its first call in the spring. By the end of the first year, it had relocated 41 women. By the end of the 3rd year, it had relocated 416. It paid for lawyers. It paid for plane tickets. It paid for small apartments in coastal towns where the women had once visited on honeymoons and had spoken about, occasionally, the way people speak about places they secretly intend to return to. Caspian's name did not appear anywhere in the Foundation's literature. He had insisted on that. The board listed only the founder, in memoriam, and the words underneath her name read simply, "She held the light." Late one night in the 2nd year, Soren stood in the doorway of Caspian's office at the Foundation's headquarters, and he watched Caspian read a case file, and he said in a hushed voice, the only thing he had ever said to Caspian about Vesna in all the years that followed. "She is still changing you, even now." Caspian did not look up from the file. He said, "I know. I'm trying very hard to let her." 2 years became 3, and 3 became 4, and the man who had once been the most feared figure on the eastern coast became, by slow and deliberate degrees, a figure people in Halverston could no longer quite categorize. He was still wealthy. The Vance name still opened doors. The shipping firm still ran. The construction companies still built. But the docks had been quietly sold 2 years in to a consortium of legitimate operators. The restaurants had been audited, every one of them, voluntarily, and the books had been cleaned by a team of accountants Caspian had paid almost more than they were worth. The men who had once enforced the Vance name in dark places had been retired, one by one, with full pensions, with severance packages large enough that none of them would ever again need to do the kind of work they had done. The young men who had once been recruited at 18 and 19 were no longer recruited. The pipeline had been turned off. There was no one coming up behind Caspian Vance because Caspian Vance was not building anything that required someone to come up behind him. The organization, in other words, was being dismantled the way the Veronin family had been dismantled, patiently, precisely, and from the inside. Soren had asked him once, in the 3rd year, whether he was afraid. Caspian had said, "Of what?" Soren had said, "Of what we used to be, of the men who still remember." Caspian had said, "Soren, the only man I was ever afraid of in this life was the one I was becoming. I am not becoming him anymore. There is no one left who frightens me." The foundation grew. By the 4th year, it had offices in 6 cities. It had a hotline that received an average of 900 calls a month. It had a network of safe houses, lawyers, relocation specialists, child psychologists, and a small fund kept off the public ledger for women whose situations required the kind of help that did not appear in foundation brochures. Caspian funded that fund personally. He never asked what the money was used for. He simply made sure there was always more of it than was needed. In the 4th spring, a woman named Marisol Quintana called the hotline at 2:14 in the morning from a gas station bathroom on the outskirts of a city 300 miles south of Halverston. She was 29. She had 2 children, a girl who was 6 and a boy who was 4. Her husband was a man named Esteban Reyes Castile, the only son of a family that owned half of the trucking routes on the southern corridor, and he was, that night, looking for her. The call was flagged. It was flagged by Caspian himself, who had begun, in the 2nd year, a habit of reading the intake summaries every morning the way other men read the news. He recognized the shape of the situation immediately. The husband. The family. The kind of resources that would be brought to bear when a woman like Marisol disappeared from a man like Esteban. Within 40 minutes, a car arrived at the gas station. Within 6 hours, Marisol and her children were in a safe house in a city she had never been to. Within 2 weeks, she was in a small apartment with new locks and a new lease, and a name she had not used since college. Within 3 months, she had a job at a small accounting firm whose owner had been quietly told, by a man she had never met, that any disruption to Marisol's employment would be considered a personal disruption to him. Within 6 months, the foundation's lawyers had secured her full custody of her children and a restraining order against her husband that was enforced, the one time it needed to be enforced, by federal agents who arrived at his house at 5 in the morning with a warrant signed by a judge whose name he had never heard. Esteban Reyes Castile spent the next several years of his life attempting, and failing, to find his wife. He never did. By the time he stopped trying, his family no longer fully owned the house he lived in, and the trucking routes that had once carried his family name now carried someone else's. Marisol did not learn what had become of him for almost 2 years. By then, she was 31, and she was the head accountant at the firm where she had once been a clerk, and her daughter, who was now 8, was learning to play the piano, and her son, who was now 6, had just won a small science fair at his school for a project on how plants respond to music. Marisol went to a foundation event that fall. It was held in a small private hall in Halverston, and it was a quiet evening. No press, no photographers, only the women whose lives the foundation had touched and the small staff who had touched them. She did not know who Caspian Vance was. She had never been told the name of the foundation's benefactor. She knew only that her case had been flagged, years before, by someone the staff referred to, in soft voices, as the founder's husband. She saw him across the hall. He was a tall man in a dark suit, standing alone near the window, watching the room without speaking. He had gray at his temples now, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes, and he wore a thin chain around his neck that disappeared under his collar. She walked over to him. She did not know why. She would later say that she had simply felt, in some way she could not explain, that she had been meant to. She said, "Are you the founder's husband?" He looked at her. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes softened. He said, "I was." "Yes," she said. "Then I need you to know something." He waited. She said, "My daughter is alive. My son is alive. I am alive. We are alive because of your wife. I never met her. I never will. But I have told my children her name every night for 2 years. They know who she was. They know what she did. They are growing up, both of them, knowing that a woman they will never meet is the reason their mother came home." Caspian did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was almost a whisper. He said, "Thank you for telling me." She said, "No. Thank her." She reached into her bag, and she took out a small piece of folded paper, and she handed it to him. "My daughter drew this. I told her I might meet you tonight. She wanted you to have it." He unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing of a house, with 3 figures standing in front of it, a woman and 2 children, all holding hands. Above the house, in careful, deliberate crayon letters, were 2 words, "Still here." Caspian held the drawing in both hands. He did not trust himself to speak. Marisol nodded once, the way strangers nod when they have said the thing they came to say, and she walked away. He took the drawing home that night. He framed it the next morning. He hung it on the wall of Vesna's studio, beside her letter, in the place where the morning light from the eastern window touched the wall first. 7 years after the night on Merrow's Edge, on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, Caspian Vance walked alone through the small cemetery on the hill above Halverston with a bundle of wild lavender in his hand. He was 47 years old. The gray at his temples had spread. He walked with the slight care of a man whose knees had begun to remember, in cold weather, every fall he had taken in his life. He wore a dark wool coat, and the chain around his neck was longer now, because over the years he had added to it 2 thin links from a bracelet that had once been his grandmother-in-law's, a small medallion that had belonged to his mother, the original wedding ring, all of them resting against his chest under his shirt, where no one ever saw them, but where he felt them, every day, when he put on his clothes in the morning. The cemetery was on the eastern slope of the ridge, behind a small white chapel that had been there since before the city had a name. The cypress trees along the path were 100 years old. The wind in them sounded, on certain afternoons, like the voice of someone trying to tell you something just out of reach of language. Vesna's grave was in the second row from the back, under a maple tree she would have liked. The stone was modest. Her name, the years, and a single line beneath, chosen by Caspian after 17 drafts. She held the light. He came every Tuesday. He had not missed a Tuesday in 7 years. He had come in rain, in snow, on the morning after his own father's funeral, on the afternoon he had signed the final papers dissolving the last of the old organization, on the day the foundation had passed its 1000th case. He had come on his birthdays. He had come on hers. He came not because he believed she was there, listening, in any way he could prove. He came because the act of coming had become, over 7 years, the thing that kept him a particular kind of man. He knelt at the grave. He set the lavender against the stone. He sat with his hands folded for a long time without speaking. When he finally spoke, his voice was the voice of a man who had been speaking to her, in his head, every day for 7 years, and who no longer needed many words. He said, "I'm becoming him, Vesna. The one you saw. It's slow, but I think I'm getting closer." He said, "The foundation took on 1,046 cases this year. We opened an office in another country. There's a young woman from the south who's taking over Soren's seat in the spring. Soren is going to retire. He says he wants to fish. I don't believe him, but I'm letting him pretend." He said, "I drew a building yesterday, the first one in 28 years. It's not very good, but I drew it." The wind moved in the cypress trees. Down at the gates of the cemetery, a woman in a long gray coat walked through with a small bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums. She was middle-aged, her dark hair shot with silver, and she walked with the kind of steady purpose that comes from having survived something that should have ended her, and chosen, anyway, to keep walking. Caspian recognized her. It took him a second. It had been 2 years since the foundation event. It was Marisol. She did not see him at first. She walked to a grave 4 rows away and knelt, and she set down the chrysanthemums, and she sat with her hands folded the way he sat with his. After a long time, she stood, and she turned, and her eyes met his across the rows of stones. She did not approach him. He did not approach her. They simply looked at each other. 2 people who had each lost the thing they had loved most in the world, and who had each, in the quiet years that followed, built something out of the wreckage that they would not have known how to build before. She nodded to him. He nodded back. Then she walked slowly down the path toward the gate, and he turned back to Vesna's stone, and the wind moved again in the cypress, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a bell in the small white chapel rang the hour. He stood up. His knees were stiff. He touched the chain at his throat. He touched the stone, briefly, with the flat of his palm, the way a man touches the shoulder of someone he is going to see again next week. He walked down the hill. The light over Halverston was the color of old gold and rust, the leaves on the maple trees along the access road turning the way they turned every October, the harbor below glittering, the bridge across the inlet carrying its small, steady traffic of people going home. In a small apartment on the south side of the city, a young woman was unpacking the last of her boxes in a kitchen with a window that faced east. In a coastal town 400 miles south, a 6-year-old girl was learning to read. In a quiet office on the 3rd floor of a building in Halverston, the foundation hotline rang, and a woman answered it on the 2nd ring, and a voice on the other end said, in a trembling whisper, "I think I need to leave tonight." A man named Caspian Vance got into his car. He started the engine. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. He thought, as he did almost every Tuesday, about a bookshop on the corner of Vine and Ashbury, 21 years ago, and a young woman with tea-colored eyes who had reached for the same book of poems he had reached for. And he thought about how a single afternoon can change the entire shape of a life, and how the people who change us are almost never the ones who stay. He drove down the hill into the wind. Behind him, on the headstone, the lavender shifted slightly in the breeze. The rest of the world, as it always had, kept going.